So, say the issue of marijuana. I mean, where do you fall on that issue? That if this is really an issue of looking at public health issues
Sure.
and the regulation of behavior?
This is what I would say. See, I believe in the holistic dynamic nature of this particular polemic, because ultimately what we're talking about is a social condition that extends way beyond marijuana, cocaine, crack, trans fats, cigarettes. What we're talking about is people coping with the stressors of living in Americana. And that's what we have to deal with. And I think I don't think it takes too much of a leap to connect that to the fact that, 20% or 10% of the population hold about 90% of the wealth, right? People are scrounging to keep a proper lifestyle together, and it's hard, it's stressful, and there's a lot of social challenges out there nowadays, and people are looking for solves to those stressors, those anxieties. And so to talk about the legalization of marijuana or whatever the case may be, if it's not marijuana, it's going to be something else.
Okay, but let me ask you this though, because as an economist, are you suggesting then that if people were in a better situation economically, that they would not, say, smoke weed?
I would say that if people were in a better situation economically, they might make different choices.
Okay.
And what we know right now is that marijuana consumption it crosses class lines. It's something that's very much a part of the social fabric in our nation. But so is opiate-based drug use, right? So I can't make a direct link there.
Gotcha.
But I do think that if we're talking about this issue of legalizing marijuana, Milton Friedman was a very big proponent of legalizing marijuana for free market principles strictly, right? Because by regulating, you're doing more harm in terms of creating cost efficiencies and benefits for the general populace than you would if you were to keep the ban in place. So from that perspective, I would agree that it makes more sense to go ahead and legalize it and have the government regulate it so we can gain more revenue, right? I mean, that makes more sense. In terms of curbing the behavior, again, I'm just not so sure that we'll be able to curb the behavior, because we've had regulations in place, and I don't think it's been too successful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I probably would fall on the other side of the issue on that from you in terms of actually legalizing it. I would have a lot of concerns about that, but I do believe that our efforts to regulate it have been ineffective.
Let me ask you this question. I know we're talking about regulation, like de jure regulation, right? It's still out here. We can go outside right now, and you can get marijuana anytime you want to.
Absolutely.
So even though it's a regulation, it doesn't seem to really have curbed the appetite for the drug, and it doesn't. I don't see police on every corner busting all the people that they know are out there selling the drug. So what does regulation mean?
Okay, but if we legalize it, then now we're bringing it sort of up to out into the daylight, if you will. So now I'm walking into CVS with my kids, right? And I go and I get a pack of gum and I grab a People magazine, and there's a pack of weed right there as well.
Right.
Now I may have had a rough day, and I may not necessarily be a heavy weed smoker, but say I smoke every now and then. The access to that marijuana, I believe, and studies would also back me up on this, would make its usage, I think, more common in our culture.
Potentially, maybe. I don't know.
Well, but obviously, I mean, we can't argue on the idea that access, whether it be casinos, whether it be hamburgers, whether it be weed, whether it be alcohol. I mean, look at our communities.
Right.
It's no wonder why so many people struggle with alcoholism, because there is such a high level of access to these things. Now, would they get it anyway? Sure. But let's figure out ways to discourage those that may not take that extra drive.
And that's the point. It's the discouragement. It's the best social influencer is always the voice and the perspective of your peers. So it's not necessarily the government from on high telling you to do something, because if your peers are doing the same behavior, then ultimately, your validation for participating in that behavior is going to be reflective of their will.
But the government allows your peers to do things. Like for instance, okay,
That's true.
So let's say drinking, okay? Like one of the things that just drives me crazy is that drinking, alcoholism, the social effects of drinking, domestic violence, drinking while driving, this has been a significant health problem.
Right.
But then you turn on television and you watch the basketball game, and they're advertising alcohol.
That's right.
And so, and they're doing it in a way that makes it very cool, and it makes it very, common. So while I look at that, I say, yes, my peers are doing it, but the government has the ability to stop me from seeing those images from my peers in the same way.
Or to put various caveats in place which say, okay, hey, drinking is cool, but if you're going to drink, have a designated driver.
Yeah, but does that work though?
Well, the statistics bear out the fact that we have fewer homicides on the road because of that.
Okay, so just let's pull out off our professor hats for 1 second,
Sure.
okay? And so I'm watching P. Diddy, and he's advertising alcohol, and I've seen he's got some very flashy alcohol commercials where he's like, you know, dancing and stuff like that. And then, you know, I see these beautiful women, and I see the alcohol, and I want to be cool. And then at the very end, they flash this little tiny few words. It's like, you know, you're gonna drink responsibly, and I'm thinking, does that really have an impact on my behavior, or am I so caught up in the imaging of it? So
indeed. So again, that's one impact. The other side of that story, though, is the fact that in the back of your head, even though that it might seem like that little bitty disclaimer is having a negligible effect on the overall message, what you're also cued to with that little disclaimer is the story you might have read in the Chicago Tribune, or the anecdote that was shared to you by a student or a friend about the fact that a loved one was killed or murdered because of drunken driving. And so again, those social impacts are very important, and they do resonate in our consciousness. And I think what we should be focusing on is a holistic paradigm of informing people to proper behaviors.
Gotcha. And you know what? I agree with you on that. I just think that holistic effort can and should include some level of regulation and mandating of particular kind of behaviors. However, I do know that alone will not accomplish what we're trying to accomplish.
I think we can concur on that point.
Yeah.
But let's get back to this issue of deception.
Sure.
Right? So because that's really a hard point for me as well. Because when we talk about regulation, I mean, regulation is a good thing. But you know, again, what are we regulating? If we say, all right, let's regulate alcohol or let's regulate marijuana, that's fine that you decide to go ahead and put policies in place to say those things are going to be illegal, or we're going to curb the incidence of making liquor licenses available in certain locales. You have to go through a pretty rigorous process in order to have a liquor license and sell alcohol and whatnot. At the end of the day, what objective are we attempting to obtain? And I think this is something we have to consider. What sort of society are we trying to nurture? What vision for America are we trying to put forth?
That's an important question.
So I mean, at the end of the day, the original question was about personal freedoms versus government responsibility. And philosophically, I think we need to have a very focused discussion on what sort of country, what sort of social fabric are we trying to promote moving forward.
Okay.
And I don't think we have the discussion in earnest.
We don't, but I think we can agree on a couple basic things. We don't want people dying tragically because of drunk drivers. We don't necessarily want, you know, our kids walking around high all day.
Right.
We don't want people texting and driving, right? And so I think those are things that, and I fully agree with you, but oftentimes I find this in my work doing politics and political science and having these conversations, is that I think people oftentimes are a lot closer on these goals than our conversation lends us to believe.
I would agree.
So I think we can probably sit down and come up with a whole set of public health goals, agree on those goals, and move forward. And I think the opportunity for disagreement, or the areas in which we disagree, are probably a lot smaller than we even make them.
I do agree with that, but I think the separation is exacerbated by, again, this deception, this general deception that is seeded by for-profit motives.
Yeah.
You know, and that's a problem that I have. That's a problem that's been a part of our culture for as long as we've been here.
Yeah, you're right.
And so when we talk about, you know, again, regulation and looking out for the social good, the government has a very important role to play, because they're basically the protectors of the average citizen that doesn't have the same information about food products, about the dangers associated with alcohol consumption or cigarette smoke. They don't have that information, the same information that a big mega firm might have. And so for that purpose, I think the government has a very tangible and important role to protect the best interests of American citizens, and at the very least, to keep them very well informed so that they can make good decisions.
And you hit it right on the head. Without the government's role, companies would not provide nutrition labels. They would, you know, not necessarily provide safe working conditions or sanitary work conditions. Right. I mean, think about this, just living in the city of Chicago, you know, there are a lot of places that you go into that from the outside look horrible. On the inside, they got the best food, you know, in the city.
That's
you
right,
know,
that's right.
That's often kind of the way that it goes.
Right.
But, you know, I'd be terrified. I mean, sometimes I already am terrified to go into some of these places for the food, but I'd be even more terrified if I knew that there was not a city department that was going to shut them down if
Bingo.
they were not. And so I think we definitely can agree on that, for sure. They do have a very strong role to play. But I think where we have this question, because the American spirit is a spirit of independence. The American spirit is a spirit of rebellion. We were born out of rebellion, and so we rally around this. We have an Independence Day. That's right. And that independence that we celebrate is not always just independence from the British.
No, no, no.
We're oftentimes celebrating our own individual independence to do whatever the heck we want to do as Americans, and then suffer the social consequences.
That's right.
Which there are many.
Yeah, but for me, it's really a celebration of independence from tyranny as a concept, right? Tyranny from big companies, tyranny from the British, tyranny from an oppressor, your enslaver, just tyranny in general. And I think that's something that we can all celebrate together. And again, if we look at the evolution over time in America of this, again, this polemic, up until about the early 1900s, we basically did have a totally free market system with some exception. And then around the 1930s, 1920s, and 30s, we started to see a shift where more government regulation was preferred. Why? Because moneyed interests took advantage of people in various forms. And so now, 70, 80 years later, we're grappling with, again, a proper balance of government responsibility and then this personal liberty issue. But the thing we have to always keep in mind is that whether it's the government, whether it's private firms, we have to look after our best interests and make sure that those tyrannical forces that would use us as pawns for profit or power are kept at bay and kept at check. And so ultimately, I would say that the government doesn't have the most responsibility in this regard. I would say that private firms don't have the most responsibility. It's households. You and I, people who are hopefully, the millions of those who are listening to this show, they should be edified, have this conversation with their families about making good personal decisions, and then advocating those types of policies that would do the same.
It was very well said. I have to come take your class. It was. I mean, I
appreciate that.
No, I'm serious, man. That was very well said. I think that's probably a good place for us to end today. So thank you.
Thank you.
While the choices you make might be your own, their ramifications are often felt across society. Try to keep that in mind as you live your life, spend your money, and interact with others. For the professors, I'm Ted Williams.